I believe most instructional designers have the ability to create learning games. So I'm not necessarily of the school of thought that you have to be a very different person with a very different school background, if you like. That said, I think that learning designers need to think about some additional elements if they're going to create a serious game or a games-based learning application, particularly if it's going to utilise 3D gaming technology. And the main area that they need to think about is that third dimension, that environment by itself. And that gives us opportunities, but also can give us issues in terms of navigation around that space. It can also utilise context much more within that learning experience. So that third dimension, the 3D element of it, gives us both opportunities but challenges as designers to think about how we utilise it to maximise the productivity of the learning that's occurring within it. And the final thing I would say that they need to do differently is think about their traditional design process. In the past, I think it's fair to say that instructional designers have used a traditionally linear approach, certainly a waterfall approach to design, whereas creating within a 3D environment lends itself to rapid design, rapid prototyping, creating iterations, getting user feedback as quickly and as frequently as we can, and then extending from there. So as opposed to spending lots and lots of time on paper storyboards, there is a real true ability within 3D serious games to get stuff on screen, to get learner feedback, to get client feedback, and to iterate. And I think that process change would be one of the biggest things I would urge them to think about.
Well, I think for both, you need to be thinking about motivation and engagement, and that's as true of instructional design as it is of games design. But perhaps the key difference is that for instructional design, for standard e-learning, you're looking at the quickest possible time to competence, whereas perhaps for games, you're inviting people to spend a bit longer.
Well, I think there's many answers to that, one of which is to recognise that a game is an environment, a system, it's not so much about content. It's to break out of that how do we order the content in a structured way into a more of how do we create an environment in which people exhibit behaviours or act and exhibit strategies. It's a very different way of thinking from the traditional kind of tools-based instructional design approach, especially in e-learning. That'd be one way. I think a second challenge is, this is probably more a comment on the sad indictment of corporate training, is that you've got to learn to open your mind again, and to explore the possibilities or the opportunities, because if there are so many, yes, we know our kind of a day jobs mean we have to deliver certain objectives, certain timescales, certain resources. So it's about how do you explore these rich and different opportunities but still deliver effective results.
The first premise to start with is use simulator. You're going to try and create a simulation. You want to put the person in control of the key variables, and you want to build their understanding of the relationship between those variables and how different decisions have different outcomes and how those relate to each other.
Yeah.
Now that's about really discovering a topic. Instructional designer, e-learning person, unless they're a subject matter expert in that, they're not going to know what those key variables are. So actually the key skill is being able to take apart a particular subject down to its specific levels, think outside of a framework, for goodness sake, think outside of a question and 3 or 4 answers, because that's certainly not how it works. Think about what would I do in order to simulate this, because if you make a really great simulation, it'll be a great tool for learning.
Well, I'm going to speak from a research perspective because I'm Director of Learning rather than somebody that does instructional design day to day. I think many of the same considerations have to be taken account of, so things like engagement, motivation, all those kinds of things still apply, whether you're designing a scenario, whether you're designing a game. However, I would say that when you're designing a game, perhaps the way you manipulate the levels or the way you reward might be slightly different.
Okay, that's a very good question, a very difficult question from Patrick Dunn. I mean, obviously I'm going to point to elements of my own work in terms of what you could do. We've done some work around the four-dimensional framework, which actually sets forward 4 dimensions: the learner, pedagogy, the context, and the representation. And if you follow that model, it really helps you to both select games and also to help to support serious game development as well. So I would really point people into that kind of work. So you really do need to have some sort of theoretical basis. You can't just come up with it and say, okay, I'm going to do this. So I think the thing to do is just think through carefully who are the learners, what pedagogic approaches you're going to take, how high the levels of fidelity you need to be in the game, and what the context of gameplay will be. The other thing worth mentioning is the blended approaches definitely work better. It's like with e-learning, blended approaches definitely work better than just having a standalone game. So I think the thing is to integrate together, to blend, and to also look at the kind of four dimensions and try and support your work with that kind of conceptual basis. And then I think you've got a better chance of being effective in the way you use games.
Okay, so I think if you're used to conventional sort of e-learning instructional design, it can seem quite a leap. And if you look at the sorts of games that people are talking about, perhaps 3D games, it may seem that there's no way to bridge that gap. But I think it's important to understand there are stepping stones on the way, and probably for me scenarios is one of them, and thinking differently about what you're doing in terms of building in challenges into that work. So you can build a simple scenario which starts to feel a little bit more like a game quite easily without having to use very complex technology or without having to completely change the way you do things. That means then learning content is provided as feedback, and the basic model is that you present somebody with a challenge, and when they fail, the feedback comes from that. And I think then building up the sophistication of that, it will start to feel more like a simulation, maybe even more like a game.
I think some of the main points would be to make sure they're not linear. E-learning is quite linear, so in terms of instructional design, make sure that you can go back and forth and make the play quite interesting and dynamic. I also think fun is a huge element. Make sure there's lots of fun, so test it with your audience, find out what your audience are doing in terms of what they do for fun, what types of games that they play, what types of social networks they're a part of, and take all of those elements into consideration. And in terms of engagement, you probably also need to look at rewards, a reward system. So not a reward in terms of being given an object like a prize or something, but an in-game reward to know that you're kind of achieving your goals and to constantly see your progress, cause and effect and feedback.
The primary thing is to think about the gameplay and the game mechanics and the engagement of the process before the learning. So we always describe it as a kind of continuum between, on one side of the spectrum is the kind of educational stuff, on the other side of the game is a pure game, pure entertainment game. If you try and land it directly in the middle, it'll be neither. So we've just been debating this in the office about whether that is actually the approach that we take, and I think it is. But what we do is we take a gameplay mechanic or we take a game genre and we unpack it and think about what makes that good, and then try and fold in, like folding over in a cookery thing, whatever that process is where you have to fold things over. You very gently fold in the fluffy stuff, which is actually in this analogy the educational side of things. But it's more of an art form than a science.
Yeah.
So it's new, and I think very few people have done it successfully. And it's very difficult because that folding process, like making a whatever it is souffle, they're really tough to make.